Welcome to the Global Experience Leaders series, where we talk to the leaders behind the multilingual digital future, how they lead, innovate, and grow their careers. I'm Spence Green, CEO of Lilt, and this week we're joined by Karen Combe, who was the longtime VP of Localization at PTC, where she was responsible for product localization, language technology, and strategy, as well as for localization support for global services, technical support, and marketing. Today, she consults on localization strategy, and she also teaches an online course at the Localization Institute. All right, I'm joined today by Karen Combe, who's a consultant, but before that was VP of Localization at PTC for many years and is now teaching with the Localization Institute. So thanks for joining me today, Karen.
Thanks for asking me to come.
Well, we got a bunch of stuff to talk about, but I wanted to start back at the beginning. So two things in your background. One, you were in the Peace Corps in Senegal, where is a very linguistically rich and diverse environment. And you were also a linguistics major at Berkeley, where the word linguist in an academic setting means something very different. So I wonder how these two experiences sort of influence the life you've chosen in language?
Well, so the thing is, Spence, you're kind of assuming that I have had a directed life, and
Okay.
that's not necessarily the case. Um, I did absolutely do linguistics at Berkeley, and of course, the idea of linguistics is to take a structured approach to language, to analyze how languages are put together and the various syntactical and semantic elements of them, in addition to looking at historical evolution of languages. And I found that, I mean, I've been attracted to languages since a very early age. But I have to say, it wasn't from any very intellectual point of view. I liked trying to say other languages, and I guess you could say I liked the mouthfeel of them. I was
Hmm.
particularly drawn to French very early on, and then to Russian. I was the youngest in my family, and my elder siblings had lots of books that they had to study in school, and there were always Russian books, and not in Russian, but by Russian authors. And I read them, and I liked to try to pronounce their names in the way that I thought was appropriate. And that was just, I'm also kind of musical, not talented in any way, but sort of musical. And I think that's all part of the whole syndrome of what attracted me to languages. Uh, in the Peace Corps, when you join the Peace Corps, you have to do a battery of tests. And one of the things that they test you for is language ability.
Hmm.
And I evidently tested fairly strongly in that area, and that's why one of the reasons why they sent me to Senegal, because the notion was that you did need French to function, but you also needed the capability of learning another language.
And were you already a fluent French speaker at that point, or you developed that later?
I was a pretty good French speaker at that point because of a special summer school course that I did when I was in high school that was 8 weeks of 4 hours a day. And at that time, it was very unusual and innovative to have a language lab. So
Hmm.
we'd spend 2 hours in the classroom and 2 hours in the language lab. And again, I got to exercise speaking French rather than having an emphasis on grammar and stuff. So I really liked that, and it took. So I was happy to be able to go to a place where, and of course, the Peace Corps gives you excellent training in language, or it did at the
Sure.
time.
So you said you didn't have a necessarily deterministic or predictable career path. So what did you think you were going to be when you were younger? Localization is not usually something that people have in mind when they're 12, 13 years old or something like that.
No, one doesn't know what it
Yeah.
is. But I have to say honestly that I did not know what I was going to do. I knew I was going to go to college,
Hmm.
and after college, I thought, oh, Peace Corps, that's going to be interesting. And then after that, I spent a year in Europe and then a couple of years in North Africa with a different voluntary organization. And eventually, I, I spent 8 years working on my family's ranch in northwestern Colorado, and eventually settled in Boulder, Colorado, and thought it would be good to get, gainful employment, um, and didn't really have any skills that were saleable as far as I knew.
Hmm.
but I got a temporary job at ILE and then stayed there for 10 years.
So now tell us about that. I mean, I think the structure of the industry structure then, many of the tools that we know now, the companies we know now, even the whole mechanism of having, sort of this distributed freelance supply chain, none of that existed at that time. So tell us what the industry sort of looked like, and how a localization program ran in the late 80s and early 90s.
Well, ILE might have been a little bit particular in that way. The owners were a married couple. He was French, Bernard Gatteau, and he had actually done. He worked for IBM for years, and he had actually done some translation himself. So he had a sense for what the actual skill was that was needed. And so we actually had an extensive network of freelancers. We
You
didn't use
did.
agencies at all. And that was a huge part of the operation, and a huge part of the effort was to find and qualify and continually evaluate those translators,
Uh-huh.
editors, and proofers. And those were all different people at the time. And so there was we got a larger and larger database of people and had to even, we started out with one guy part-time looking for translators. And then eventually that grew to, I think, a group of 3 people. And that was and all of that was to ensure very high translation quality. And that was all quite a manual process. I mean, there were translators were using cat tools, but the rest of it, the managing of the translators, the project management, all of that was super manual.
That's right.
So it was, go ahead.
I was under the impression that the sort of outsourcing and the use of freelancers was more an innovation of the mid to late 90s, when the internet was more widely available, and you could start to work with French speakers and in Africa and so on. And prior to that, a lot of people had internal translation teams. Is that so? How did you communicate with them? By phone, or they were using email, or
Phone
how did
and
that work?
email and dial up, and we did have some internal translators.
Yeah.
We did not have large groups of them. We had maybe 2 or 3 per major language, but really most of the work was done with outsource. I mean, and I mean, we weren't trying to do 40 languages.
Sure.
Our biggest project, I think, was around 22 languages, and one of them was Latin. We had to do Latin for a project. That was fun, trying to find somebody to do that. But it was still freelancers, all freelancers, and all manual.
So now, over the course of a 10-year period, you were promoted to all the way up to a VP title at that company. What does the promotion path look like on the supplier side at that point?
Well,
Did you start as a project manager and then
I
go
did.
up from
Well,
there?
no,
Yeah.
I actually started as a temporary receptionist, but
Okay.
and then they taught me to use a computer, which was cool. And then I did some desktop publishing, which was not a huge skill of mine. I was more the person who wanted things to be organized, and moved more or less obviously into project management for that
Hmm.
reason. So the owners at a certain point wanted to step back a little bit from their very heavy responsibilities. And I, at that time, was managing, 13 of our clients and our biggest ones. And they evidently decided they thought I could be helpful, so they appointed me general manager. And so at that time, I managed all of the operations. And then later on, the one of the owners who was in charge of sales and marketing decided that she wanted to step back further, and she looked around the company and she put her finger on me again and said, "Okay, you go and manage sales and marketing." And so that's how I ended up in that position.
And then in the late 90s, you decided to switch to the buyer side and you went
Mm.
to PTC, which was founded by a mathematician. And last time you and I spoke, you were telling me a little bit about the innovation culture and the sort of culture of continuous change and optimization there. And it's only had 3 CEOs in its 40-year history, so it's sort of a unique company. Tell us a little bit about that culture and how it compared to your other experience on the supplier side.
Well, so experience on the supplier side was more about innovation in process
Mm-hmm.
and trying to change process to keep up with the demands of an evolving industry. At PTC, the innovation was less around process or even organization and more about product. Um, ProEngineer was the first product that was created. It was revolutionary at the time. Uh, PTC just skyrocketed and went public in the 90s and was a $1 billion company.
Yeah, it
Uh,
was $800 million in revenue in like 1997 or something. It's
I
a
know, it's
huge
just
company.
extraordinary.
Yeah.
And and people did very well. But then the other companies started to compete. Dassault, particularly, and well, what eventually Siemens acquired in the CAD area.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, PTC was also moving more into product data management. So that kind of went along with CAD. But then after 2000 and the devastation in a lot of tech companies, PTC really had, and the level of competition, PTC really had to start to reinvent itself, which it has now done to a pretty effective degree um, in adding product data management and eventually moving on to the Internet of Things and augmented reality
Right.
and SaaS-based systems. But that was all a pretty wrenching sort of series of activities, and there was a I suppose I would say a certain amount of resistance from, for example, the development people who had been there from the beginning, because there were many who had been there from the beginning. They thought that anything that was not CAD development that needed a couple of PhDs in math, was really, you know,
we,
is it worth doing,
those of us trained in that way tend to have this attitude that's not maybe the most conducive to relationship building, but
Exactly, exactly.
right.
But I
Cool.
have to say that Jim Heppelmann, who's the current CEO,
Mm-hmm.
very effectively led the company through those various changes. He's charismatic, and one of the things about him is that he's very straightforward, so that when he talks to you, there's this very natural tendency to believe what he says. And so he's been
It's a
able to
profoundly useful characteristic in a leader.
truly.
Yeah.
And so he was able to affect that change. There were very various programs. There was like a 5-year plan at one point that was meant to lead the company and the technology from one place to another place, and that was pretty widely adopted throughout the company. And eventually, they stopped hiring CAD engineers and
Mm-hmm.
started hiring people with other skill sets, and that sort of brought new energy into the company as well. But it's a really fascinating company, I think.
So tell us a little bit about the evolution of the localization group. You've described sort of the macro changes in the business with the rise of other CAD competitors, and then of course probably later in the 2000s having to shift to SaaS, which is an extremely complicated transition for a company to make. Where did sort of PTC localization start, and where did it sort of end up where you left it, and maybe just a couple of big milestones along the way?
Well, so I would say that the major thing that happened is that when I got to PTC, it was not a localization department; it was a translation team
Mm-hmm.
that was under the documentation umbrella. And I was actually hired to create a localization department.
And many
And
many localization departments started in sort of tech pubs. Is that right?
yes, yes,
Yeah.
and it still is kind of a natural tendency when translation needs to start, they look around for somebody who can manage it, and they
Hmm.
say, "Oh, writing, that's writing another language. Let's get those pubs people to do it."
Yeah. Right.
That might be less of a tendency now that there's a lot more technology involved,
Hmm.
but it certainly was for a long time. And so we had lots of translators. We had like 5 translators per language for the supported languages. Um,
Internally.
Internally, yeah.
Wow.
And we did outsource, but a lot of all of the software was done in-house. And so uh, we gradually transformed from a focus on internal translation to much more of a technology and project management focus and
Hmm.
program management. Um, at the time, for example, our products were not being what we felt was effectively QA'd. So we built a quality assurance department for the localized product, and we gradually adopted more technology in-house, a TMS system, for example, in 2003.
Oh, that was
We
quite
bought
early, wasn't it?
WorldServer. Yeah. Well,
Back when it was idiom, right?
yeah. And we had support from our marketing department. It was
Hmm.
originally purchased for marketing,
Hmm.
and that's of course the way WorldServer was originally created. And then we adopted it for products. And so we, as sort of the technology in the industry uh, increased and changed, we adopted more and more of it. Uh, we certainly adopted MT at a certain point, but we were of a size that we had the opportunity to kind of look around at what our peers in the industry were doing, leaders of localization of much larger companies. And so we kind of watched what they were doing, and when they seemed to be successful, we said, okay, I guess we could probably do that too. Um, and we were not necessarily the first to take those steps,
Hmm.
but certainly followed very quickly behind others. And then the third, or maybe we're the fourth now, major change has been to integrate the localization process into the whole DevOps culture in the company.
Oh, interesting.
And that's been probably the last 3 or 4 years
And
that we've been working on that.
and is the interface there hooking into like a CI/CD or continuous deployment
Yes,
regime for the
yes,
products? Yeah. Right.
yes, absolutely.
Uh-huh.
And once your company starts doing that, then you have to get on board. And we early on uh, started sim shipping. I can't remember exactly what year it was, but we were challenged by our management to
Hmm.
make that happen, and we did ultimately. But so once you start doing that same day sim ship all languages,
Yeah.
then you get, when your development team goes on further to the idea of CI/CD, uh, you're not going to fall behind at that point and
Hmm.
have your management say, hey, you're falling behind. So actually, as soon as we learned about what CI/CD was and what DevOps were, we started talking to the stakeholders about how we could integrate localization, started thinking about it and what tools we would need and what connections we would need and all that sort of thing. So it's been a hugely important change in the company.
So now you retired with a VP title, which is relatively uncommon in localization. And going along this DevOps theme, I asked you how you got that title, and you shared a colorful story about how that came about. I wonder if you could tell us that.
Yes, well, I just first want to point out that there are getting to be more VPs of
There are more. That's true.
localization and
Yeah.
globalization, which is kind of exciting.
Hmm.
So, going back to the SimShip issue, our chief product officer at the time, uh, we used to release the Asian products, particularly months after the English product. And it was because the product wasn't properly internationalized, and we just couldn't do it any faster. And so our chief product officer used to get annoyed phone calls and emails from sales in Asia saying, where is my product? I can't sell it. And so something needed, he didn't want those calls anymore.
Okay.
So at, at a very large uh, product meeting with all of the senior product people, I presented a schedule for our upcoming release that included, releasing the Asian products in all of the languages later than the English. And the chief product officer challenged me and said, you know, we need to ship these all at the same time. Can you do that? And I said, well, yes, I think we can do that, but we need support from the development VPs and the QA team and the documentation people in order to accomplish that. And so he sort of turned to those people in the room and said, are you willing to support this effort? Of course, they all said yes. And so at that point, our reporting on status of the product involved whether those other teams, in the nicest possible way, how those other teams were also supporting the effort to allow the company to sim ship its products. And that's how it started. And that was much appreciated by our chief product officer.
So he gave you a challenge to cut that cycle time, and you said yes, and then you delivered on it.
Yes. Well, actually, the other
Okay.
people helped a little
Yep,
bit.
right. I mean, I think this is such an important issue that doesn't get talked about so much. Oftentimes you hear localization people say, oh, we're off on an island and the rest of the business doesn't know what we do. But like the stakeholder management and the dependencies within the company are actually the thing that you uniquely can do and manage in that position that your suppliers cannot. Like I could not, for example, come in and interface with your DevOps team. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, how you managed different internal stakeholders just as a business person and as a business partner.
Well, this is something that I think is hugely important. I absolutely agree with you about this. And it's also, I mean, I think you probably know that I'm part of the Guild Leaders Forum, this group of people who are running localization in various companies. We meet periodically and talk about our issues. And often what we talk about is how to become less of a sort of uh, sideline operation that just needs
Right.
to sort of get in touch with things to becoming uh, sort of mission critical, strategically oriented, and seen to be that way. And one thing that definitely needs to happen is seizing opportunities. If the challenge from our chief product officer allowed me to engage very actively with the leaders of the development organization to put I mean, we had theoretically had internationalization standards, but they weren't necessarily followed. So we got to put into process, and this is, of course, something that everybody still deals with on a regular basis. We got to put into place processes to ensure that that activity was actually occurring in the way that it should. And one of the things that I've found to be very useful over time when trying to engage with other groups is to figure out what their problems were and try to help to solve them. So, for example, publications teams all have the same issue that whatever they write has to be reviewed by subject matter experts. And those subject matter experts all have other jobs that they're doing. So often they don't want to review anything until it's quite late in the cycle on the grounds that things continue to change. So that makes publications teams very reluctant to say, okay, this is done and you can localize it. And so working with that team to figure out how to change the process to get technical review done in either a different way or on a different time scale makes them your ally. And I think that that's the point that I want to make, is that there are natural allies in any company, and if you can present you and your organization in that way, rather than as an organization that's demanding something of other people, then you get a lot further.
Yeah, I want to quote you. You teach a class at the Localization Institute, and in the abstract, it's written, quote, "Localization often sneaks in through the back door and never gets the respect it deserves. It ends up being seen as a mere operational unit, a cost center, if you will, and is not given the chance to contribute as a strategic asset that it really is." That's sort of kind of consistent, and like, to make it a strategic asset, you sort of have to, as a leader, get out there and make it an asset and
You
add
absolutely
business
do.
value, right?
Yes. And you have to tell everybody what a terrific job you're doing,
Mm-hmm.
because otherwise they won't know
Right.
necessarily. It's there's no point in being modest in a corporate environment.
I think that's accurate. So now you're out. You go out and you take a seize an opportunity, like the sort of opportunity that your CPU threw down. Now you got to manage an internal team, and oftentimes there's some hesitance amongst localization teams that have operational standards to deliver quality on time, so on, and changing an operational environment is there can be some organizational resistance there. So how did you sort of create a culture of or coach people through having a higher risk tolerance for change and trying new things, trying new technologies, but not just technologies, processes? Going to CI/CD is actually like a big operational change for a team.
I honestly have to say we didn't have a lot of resistance.
Really?
Um, yeah, no, we
That's
didn't.
interesting.
We all thought it was really exciting.
Uh huh.
So I had basically 4 people on my management team, and they collaborated super effectively and wanted to embrace whatever it was that we were going to do, because they saw how it was better for us as an organization to be well integrated into whatever the company's goals were. Whatever those goals were, we wanted to be part of them.
Mm.
And in fact, I would say that in some cases we were even leaders in adopting the DevOps culture,
Mm-hmm.
um, much faster than some other people were. And we just, I don't know, it just worked really well. It wasn't a problem, I wouldn't say.
So it's just actually good leadership, which is
That's what it is, Spence. It's just
making
good leadership.
making the team aware of the organizational goals and aligning their work with the organizational goals.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and we all did that. It wasn't just me. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the people on my team were very much in favor of going out into the organization and uh, you know working together to make things happen. And we encountered resistance occasionally from other teams, but then we chipped away at them and we got them eventually on our side.
Mm-hmm. Now you mentioned two things early on in the conversation. You mentioned World Server, and you and I actually first met through this World Server user group years
Yep.
ago that you ran for many years or was involved in. You also mentioned the Guild Group, which is a group of leaders that meet periodically to talk through things. What's been the importance for you and your career of having these sort of guilds, if you will, or communities external to PTC, for sharing best practices and learning new things? And how important do you think that is?
Well, I think that we're really lucky in the localization industry on the buyer side, particularly in that in a lot of cases we have been considered to be operational, and therefore the important thing is to be as efficient as possible. And everybody knows that benchmarking against other companies allows you to gain efficiencies. And so our management hasn't minded that we share information about how we work and how to improve how we work. And so that's allowed us to form these very strong communities that have been just enormously helpful to me, certainly, and I believe to other people as well, plus there's the fact that there's very little that's more powerful than being able to go to your management and say, well, look, over there at Autodesk, they're
Okay.
doing this, and it's
Right.
working really well for them.
Yeah.
And so we need to do that.
Uh-huh.
And, I mean, that actually has happened more than once to me.
Hmm.
And it's just, it's sort of bootstrapping on each other's experience. That continues today. People talk about, well, I managed to get my management to make this change based on having done this, and so you guys ought to try it. It's that kind of thing.
Well, let's finish up talk prognosticate about the future a little bit. I think when we talk about innovation, we sort of quickly turn to technology, and then this can reduce to a conversation about machine translation, which is not the most interesting, direction. So, but there are other things as well: process, people changes, and I wonder if you could kind of, as you look into the future, what are the 1 to 2 breakthroughs that you think would lead to a fundamental change in the way localization is done in the enterprise? And those could be problems that need to be solved, or things that you've seen, promising technologies or processes that you're excited about.
Oh, I think it's already happening. I think so. There was a time when localization was focused on translators and translation and project management.
Mm-hmm.
And because there was so much manual work.
Right.
And in the past years, over time, as technology has improved and been adopted, there's less manual work. And certainly for software companies, and even hardware now has software, um, this move towards automation and DevOps
Mm-hmm.
has meant that localization departments need to have more engineering capabilities in order just to
Right.
integrate
Exactly.
tools. And so there's been uh, maybe less emphasis on the kinds of things that project managers used to do, a lot of, file transfers and being very knowledgeable about this kind of file and that kind of file. Once you sort of establish what that is and you get it connected to something, then the information, the data is going to flow according to whatever schedule you might set up for that to happen. So I think that there's going to be more and more emphasis uh, on automation and less on manual work and more emphasis on engineering
Mm-hmm.
in the industry and less on what the people do. And
Yes.
and I think at PTC we were really lucky that we managed to hang on to one translator per language for our major supported languages. So we always had this, coming from a very strong foundation of translation quality, we managed to keep that focus.
Mm-hmm.
And even in using MT, we got to the point where we were able to say, well, maybe for this particular application, we don't need to have perfection, but for all this other stuff, we still need to have very definitely human level translation. So I think that obviously MT is more and more important and better practically every day. Um, but there still has to be that hanging on to, is anybody really going to understand it clearly once they try to read it,
Right.
But still, that said, more and more automation, I think, is what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think there are two really important concepts there that you mentioned. The first is the subtle yet really important mindset shift to everything's kind of a manual workflow and humans are going to direct all the stages versus switching to an automation workflow where humans intervene when there's an exception, but otherwise things mostly automated. And then also the idea of translation that's fit for purpose. Not everything that you produce has to be
Yeah.
of you know the quality of Voltaire or something like that. You're
Yes,
enabling people to solve problems.
absolutely. I agree with you. And apart from that, there's the notion of AI in the process. I don't know that that would ever be applicable for PTC, but certainly for uh, B2C companies where there's a lot of data that needs to be translated quickly and maybe needs to be different fit for different purposes, that so that AI is starting to be used to evaluate content type and direct it towards a particular workflow uh, through, MT only or MT plus post editing or, MT plus light post editing. So there are all these different potential processes that can be invoked, and AI is being used at the sort of outset of that type of process. And that's pretty interesting.
I agree with that. Well, Karen, thank you so much for making time to do this. This has been a joy, and I'm sure many people who are listening will, sort of encounter you in your Localization Institute classes, and then all the instruction that you're doing and mentorship to people in localization. So, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, Spence. This was fun.
All right, thank you.